Thank you so much for being here today and talking to us, our students. I'm sure they're going to get a ton out of everything that you're going to share with them, especially personally. There's going to be a lot of personal information in here that they can use for their career track and looking for jobs. So before we get to the content, could you introduce yourself and kind of share with the students the positions that you've held and how you got to where you are today in your career journey?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Shakira Walston, and I am the owner of Progressive Career Solutions. So how did I get here? I oftentimes, when you think about talent acquisition, particularly from, HR, particularly from the talent acquisition piece, people don't set out to be recruiters. They don't set out to come into this space. Oftentimes we stumble into this space, and that's exactly what happened to me. I used to be a research analyst, and I won't bore you with all the details, but I ended up stumbling into this space and taking on very, very early in my career, which we're going back nearly 20 years, not to date myself, but I ended up taking a recruitment position within an agency that ultimately propelled me into a recruitment manager, which ultimately brought me in-house as a recruiter for many financial services organizations. And now I'm able to consult with those organizations, and I'm able to help individuals navigate their way to finding meaningful positions within their careers.
So can you share with us some stories about staffing organizations related specifically to candidate assessment and later salary negotiations?
Sure. So the candidate assessment, so that has evolved over the last 20 years. I think where we're at right now is that we went from one instance where organizations felt the need because a lot of times when it's gained momentum from the IT sector, and then organizations felt the need to adapt and make it so that throughout the process of hiring or the interview process, they would implement these candidate assessments in certain scenarios for certain roles that didn't necessarily need it. So I think we're going through an evolution where many organizations, particularly within the financial services firms, where they're assessing whether there is a need for candidate assessments in the manner in which we've been traditionally using it, because it's not a one size fits all. And I think they're still learning. We're still in the process of learning. So I'll use IT as an example. When there's one scenario where organizations are actually developing their own assessments, it's not something that's cookie cutter out of the box from a vendor, where they're doing more whiteboarding sessions, which actually is a little bit more effective, as opposed to sending a candidate a link to a list of questions that they can then go off on their own to perform those assessments and then bring it back. There's gaps in that. And I think more companies are realizing that there's gaps, because the reality is there's no foolproof way of knowing who actually completed that assessment unless you're doing it live. And I think that's coming to the forefront now. There have been instances in the past where throughout the recruitment process, wherever the assessment is inserted, that's another thing. It's at which point do you take an assessment if it's online. There has been instances where a link would be sent out to a candidate. We would think they were performing the assessment, also only to find out that perhaps they sent it over to another colleague of theirs to actually complete it. There's also the notion that everyone doesn't test well. So when we talk about that piece of assessment, we have to make sure that we are creating more of an inclusive environment, which sometimes those whiteboarding sessions, those on the spot, let's talk through scenarios, tend to be more meatier and giving the hiring manager or hiring leaders more insight as to how the person's actually going to perform on the job.
Can you kind of explain what a whiteboarding session is?
Sure. So that's more live in the moment. So for example, it may be a situation where, just like you and I are talking one-on-one, where we'd have a screen and maybe I would ask a certain question, depending on the role, right? So if it's IT, I might ask someone to actually perform, I'll give them a scenario where they would have to show me the code that they would use to complete a task. And it's live right on the spot. So the beauty of that, sometimes there's an element of nervousness that comes into play there, but it's how you tee it up to get the person to feel more comfortable, and they know they're not blindsided, so they can come in and perform. And it enables them not only to provide the answer, but to talk through why they're taking the steps that they're able to take live. So it helps to really, it sometimes there's no right or wrong answer. It's more along the lines of someone assessing the way an individual thinks and how they will approach a situation. So whiteboarding is basically going in live and handling those scenarios and talking through them.
So you mentioned that not everyone tests well, and I completely agree with that. Mm-hmm. But also not everybody performs well in person. And you said that you work really hard to make them comfortable. What are some of the things that you do to make an applicant comfortable so they can perform better? Because you really want the best candidate, and you don't want stage fright to be the reason you didn't pick somebody.
I think it starts with setting the tone of the interview process. And I think it starts with that first interaction. So the way I always tee it up to my clients is when we talk about the interview process, culture starts at that first point of contact. That's the first part where a candidate's going to get a taste of what it looks and feels like to work for that organization. So in order to set the tone, it's about teeing up and having real transparent conversations, being a little bit vulnerable, because I find that when you're a little, even the interviewer or the recruiter, whoever's going to prep the candidate, when you exercise or share a little bit of that vulnerability, crack a joke, whatever the case may be, to tap into something that resonates with that interviewee, if you will, they tend to let their guard down. So one of the things that I do when it comes to coaching hiring managers on interview skills, prep, and all that stuff, or just navigating that interview process, is just have a conversation. Let's not make it a list of questions where you're so robotic because you know you have a list of questions you have to ask. Let's make it conversational at best, and say that. Tell the candidate that. Let them know, hey, listen, I'm going to ask you a set of questions, but I want to make this conversational. So if you need clarity, feel free to open up and ask me the question too, and then just kick it off there. When I find when they're more conversational and they set that tone, candidates are going to open up. They're going to feel relaxed. They're going to be more prone to asking questions, and it just makes for a better interview.
So when you get to evaluating the final applicants, so you get to say the top 5 or however number they is, how do they go about making that decision? I'm sure students are very interested in this part.
Yeah, so when it comes down to that final decision, this doesn't always happen. So if I can be fully transparent with you, I think this is the part where a lot of organizations stumble. When you're interviewing for a role, there needs to be some sort of uniformity in terms of understanding the right questions that you're asking, who's asking those questions, and making sure that we have a foolproof assessment or document or something that we can, not for lack of a better word, rate these candidates against. Because it's not just, I tried to get individuals to think, don't just think about whether the person, when I say individuals, I'm meaning hiring managers. Don't just think about whether this person you're interviewing is applicable and aligned with your particular role. Think broader terms. If they are aligned with your role, great. But if they're good for the organization, you need to be having an eye on that too. You need to also be thinking about whether they're a fit now, great. But if they're not a fit now, there might be a fit for something down the line. So we need to, we then think about the behavioral skills that we want to assess to see whether they're a good fit. And then we also want to think about future. Okay. And then there are typically what I like to say, candidate feedback forms that it's critically important for hiring managers to actually complete. And where I say organizations fall short, because that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we get the very bland feedback of, oh, this person wasn't a fit, but it's always it's really critical for the recruiter to push back and say, why? Share that with me. What was your line of thinking around that? So if you have feedback forms that are succinct to the point, if they tend to be more elaborate, hiring managers won't complete them, right? So a couple of questions. Is this candidate a good fit for your role? Yes or no? If they're not a good fit, why? Be very specific. Did they fill the skill sets or competencies that you were looking for? And then in that case, you'd already have those competency-based skills kind of ironed out. So, you know, as you're assessing and walking through the interview process, you can check off yes, no, or maybe this is something, an area I need to hone in on for the next round of interviews, or even just calling the candidate back to ask for clarity. So I think by having the feedback forms and having them customized, they cannot be cookie cutter. That helps with assessing who gets the role or not, right? So it's not just based on skills, but it's also how well the candidate, what do you think they're bringing to the table? And do they have the aptitude? Because for new entry-level roles, sometimes they don't even have the skill sets. It's all about the aptitude. So it's a matter of understanding, again, identifying the competencies that you're focusing on, and then determining whether that person has the aptitude or not to fill the role or not. So that's pretty much the framework and by which a lot of organizations work towards. Because it can't be just gut and emotion based. And that tends to happen a lot.
I agree with that. When you get to top 5, I mean, because I have done some recruiting, and I have found that it's interesting how that goes. Typically, when you get top 5, they're all qualified for the job. They meet all the minimum qualifications, and I've read some research that says it's more about the connection at that point. And I think in a team-based environment, it is, more about the connection. I know that's usually one of the discussions that happens in a team-based hiring decision. How well did you connect with the candidate? Which one did you not connect with her? I know that in a couple of instances where we were hiring somebody for new positions, newly created positions, we thought we knew what we were hiring for. We went through the whole process, but then when we got to top 5, there was this one applicant that had a skill set that was related to a product line we were considering. And that applicant actually ended up getting the offer, even though it wasn't in the job announcement. They all met the minimum qualifications, but this one applicant had the potential for a direction the organization may be going. So the candidates didn't even have information about what we were thinking about. That person got selected. So I think that top 5 is a really interesting dichotomy.
No, it is. It's an interesting dynamic. But you said something that kind of speaks to diversity and inclusion piece, right? So when it comes to the top 5, a lot of times, yes, they do have, to your point, they have the skill set, right? But it's that question around who did you connect with? That's muddy waters, because a lot of times we can have that halo effect, or it's that unconscious bias that comes into play, and that's where we need to be very careful. And again, when I preface this by saying a lot of organizations continue to operate in that mode, it's not intentional, but this is the way we've been operating for so long, and we have to be careful, because I can't just select someone because yes, there was this connection. I have to then do some soul searching to uncover why did I feel that connection? And it's about probing. So it's really incumbent upon the recruiter. And this is where some companies get it right, and we need a lot of work, right? There's a lot of companies that need a lot of work, because some recruiters don't feel confident enough to probe. At the end of the day, they just want the role filled, right? And right or wrong. But it's when we come to those scenarios, it's about probing. Well, why did you feel that connection? Because this is where you can uncover a couple of different things, whether it was in fact an unconscious bias, or whether that feeling is truly valid, or is it applicable for this particular scenario in an assessment phase, if that makes sense.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. It's one of the things we talk about in the course, is that it is the recruiter's role to watch ethical issues, moral issues, and more than that, watch statistics. You need to have statistics and metrics in place so that if there is bias going on in the hiring process, you can identify it with metrics, specifically if you can attribute it to a particular work group or a particular supervisor. So I'm really glad you jumped in on that.
Absolutely.
What about job offers? What do you usually include in a job offer?
So when we're talking about corporate America, it's really your base. So you take 2 steps back. It's the complete package, right? So the benefits, those hardcore benefits, the soft benefits, if you will, or, whether you're offering at the time pre-COVID, where it's like free lunch. I think organizations are now being very creative on how that works now with hybrid working environments. We can talk about that later in a second, but it's a culmination of your benefits and the financial gains, right? So your base, your bonus, what we like to call total rewards. So a lot of times within your compensation package, it's going to be inclusive of what organizations are now calling total rewards, which would be your base, your bonus, which it's determined upon how the cadence and how often you're being paid from a bonus perspective, whether it's annually, monthly, quarterly, and then your traditional, what I like to say, bulge bracket, and I'll define that benefit. So benefits could be that your core benefits are your health, your dental, your 401k, if they're offering that. And then all of those niceties, which we just talked about, which is around the gym memberships. So those niceties, so gym memberships, free lunch, a stipend for making sure your home office is you have all the accommodations that you need. So those are some of those niceties. Now, all organizations don't offer that, but the traditional is healthcare benefits coupled with base and bonus. And then, of course, your PTO, your time off, that self-care piece, your sick days. So all of those things tie into your entire total rewards or comp packages.
What about any potential legal concerns with job offers? Have you run into anything?
Not necessarily, because for the organizations that I've worked for and consulted for, we tend to be dotting our I's and crossing our T's. So that's not anything that any legal ramifications, I should say. So case in point, when it comes, for example, down to determining what that offer needs to be from a salary perspective, here in the United States, while not every state has adopted this legislation, but you can't ask for salary histories. So it's a certain amount of states that is the case, but what I've counseled my clients to do is adopt it, whether you sit in a state or not. Don't ask for salary history. What you can do is ask for expectations. And that makes for more of a healthier conversation when it comes to negotiating.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty much what I've been telling students too. I think that, as states start to adopt that, it's going to end up becoming a federal requirement at some point. That's usually how it works. Mm-hmm. What influences if you'll negotiate on a job offer, or how you'll go about negotiating on that job offer?
I have the pleasure of training recruiters to make sure they can navigate this in a nice way that it's less combative and more of a way that is just friendlier and it's aligned and it resonates well with the candidate. So first and foremost, the discussion around salaries tends to be uncomfortable, right? Because this is where you can have a great rapport with the recruiter. But when it comes down to that comp discussion, it's like, okay, the candidate's guard is up. The recruiter knows that they have a job to do. They need to fill it. But those discussions need to happen quite often earlier on in the conversation. We shouldn't wait. And there's a number of different reasons why. The main reasons is not to waste anyone's time, both the candidate's time as well as the company's time, right? No sense in putting a candidate through a process only to find out that we can't meet their salary expectations, okay? So you have that conversation early on around their salary expectations. And what I mean by that is they're merely a question. Recruiters just asking, what are your salary expectations? From that vantage point, the candidate can then say, what we're finding now, should even say now, I think there's been an evolution where historically in the past 10, 15 years ago, it might've been harder to get that information. Now I think candidates are coming in a little bit with a level of more confidence because they've done their due diligence. And I've always coached candidates to make sure you're doing your research online. There's this notion now where, particularly within your Gen Zers, where they're discussing compensation amongst themselves. And that's, I take it with a grain of salt, because the reality is, all the information is online. So there's ways you can determine what a range is for the salary that you're going for, whether it's you're leveraging online resources coupled with reaching out to recruiters at agencies. They fill these roles all day long. They can certainly give you insight into what the market rates are for a particular role. Absolutely. And I wouldn't say the recruiter that you're facing off to for the particular hiring organization that you're interviewing for, but you certainly can reach out to some agencies, recruiters. There's a whole host of them that actually fill these roles, and they can give you insight. So when a candidate has done their due diligence, it makes for more practical conversations around salary. And it's just a quick touch point. And as they navigate the conversation, it's incumbent upon the recruiter to then go back after candidate has interviewed hiring managers, right? To go back to how can I say, look at those conversations again, like revisit the salary. Hey, I know you had a conversation with hiring manager X. I know we initially talked about your salary expectations being here. Has that shifted? Just having honest conversations. So this way, when it comes down to the offer, and what ends up happening with that, the recruiter, and more often than not, particularly within large Fortune 500 or Fortune 50 firms, the recruiter is really driving what those salaries look like. Okay, I think a lot of people don't realize that. So the recruiter can be your advocate. You just have to be honest. And I think as you're being honest in the initial outset of the conversations, it'll make much more for a healthier offer, period. I'll pause for a second because I know I said a lot.
Okay, so sort of to wrap up the discussion, so you did mention the due diligence, and I'd like you to expand on that a little bit, but what suggestions for negotiating job offers do you have for students? So they're coming at it from the candidate perspective, or if they're in an organization and they're trying to negotiate upward mobility.
Yeah, so let's take the former question. So around students negotiating, again, it goes back to doing your due diligence. If you're interviewing, let's say hypothetically, for a marketing manager role or marketing coordinator role, right, coming right out of school, so marketing coordinator, and let's say it's in New York, you can leverage salary.com, you can leverage Glassdoor, just to get a sense as to, well, what are they paying marketing coordinators in New York? Because what they're paying in New York would vary versus what they're paying in Nebraska. That's a quick and dirty. It's going to give you a range. Okay, so now you have a base point. Okay, I can at least say whether it's 60,000 or whatever the case may be, 60 to 70,000, whatever the numbers are. So at least you have a starting point, and then you could then synthesize that information by just calling up someone, let's say, reaching out to Robert Half or reaching out to any or Tech Systems or Aerotech, tapping into a recruiter and just saying, hey, listen, here's my resume. I'm looking at navigating the job market. And I'm looking for a marketing coordinator role. What are the base salaries for New York? What are the targeted salaries? They will tell you. They have the information. They have the market insights. They can easily tell you that. So now you take that piece of data, you balance it off of what you found on Glassdoor, salary.com, and now you have a true range. So when it comes to actually going on an interview for job XYZ, and you're talking on the phone with the recruiter, and you get hit with that question that everybody kind of holds their breath, you can then say, when the recruiter says, what are your salary expectations? You can firmly say, you have a baseline of what that looks like. And I would always encourage them to don't get fixated or so structured or rigid around what that number is. You need to have a floor, what I like to call the floor, like the bare minimum you absolutely accept. And then then at that point, anything upwards of that, you're winning, right? So you have to have a floor number, and then okay, this is whatever that floor number is, X. And I would always say you can listen. Typically, the recruiter should be coming right out the gate with asking you that. They should be talking to you about the actual role, so that you have a better understanding of responsibilities. So then you can then really formulate a true floor number, if you will, based on your research. So that's the first thing you need to do. And once you have that, you're able to navigate the hiring process a little bit more effectively. And it becomes, the negotiation starts really there. It's not at the point where they give you the offer.
So, so students who are interested in becoming recruiters, so jumping into recruiting, what types of skills do you think they should develop? What have been your most valuable skill sets?
Relationship management, and the ability, although people don't think about this often, but the ability to sell. When you think about it, recruiting, although, like I said, people don't think of it this way, but it's essentially selling. And I'm going to tell you why. As a recruiter, you are when a hiring manager has an open opportunity, you are tapping in with that hiring manager and you're talking to them. So that's where the relationship management piece comes in, right? And you're trying to get the nuts and bolts of the role that they're looking to fill. You're trying to understand. What I mean by that is the responsibilities, the tasks, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's very critical. Good recruiters get all of that. What I mean by the good is, what are some of the responsibilities of the role that are fulfilling, that's going to energize a person, that's going to get them wanting to take the job. The bad, because you want to be transparent for the candidates that you're talking to, right? So once you get that information, you can create a compelling selling point. Now you have it. You're armed with what this hiring manager is looking for. You got to take that and sell it to the candidate. You got to get them enticed and wanting to engage with it in this company. And then once you get the candidate that you think is just a sure shot for the role, you got to take that candidate, bundle them up, package them, and then sell that candidate to hiring managers. So a lot of it is just those soft selling skills that you need. Sometimes it's quick and easy, and it's not that much that a recruiter needs to do, but sometimes what you see in a candidate, sometimes it's not readily visible for a hiring manager. That's where that selling piece comes in. So I would say relationship management, selling, and just intuitive skills, listening skills, understanding what drives these candidates, because sometimes it's not only financially based.
I really want to thank you for sharing all of your insights with the students. I think this is going to be very valuable from a negotiations perspective, especially, and for those students who are interested in getting into recruiting.
My pleasure. Happy to have this conversation with you.